You see these kind of videos all the time on YouTube, a pro's perfect node tree setup. But just blindly copying them is one of the biggest mistakes you can make. Your goal shouldn't be to have their perfect node tree, but to build your own. And that's what we're going to do in this video. I'm going to share all the things I think about when I'm trying to develop a fixed node tree. And by the end, you'll have all the knowledge you need to create one that works perfectly just for you. I'm also going to show you some of the tools I use to perform different adjustments, both native tools within Resolve, as well as some of my favorite third-party options. But why do you even need a fixed node tree? Can't you just add nodes as you need them? Well, you see, a fixed node tree isn't some rigid, unchangeable cage. Think of it as your personal workflow philosophy, a predefined roadmap where you decide ahead of time where specific adjustments are going to live. Why is this a game changer? First of all, speed. In professional environments, time is everything. Having a structure means you stop wasting mental energy building the same nodes over and over again. You can jump right into the creative part of grading. Second, we've got consistency. On a long project, a fixed tree is your number one tool for making sure shot number 1 matches shot number 100, because your corrections are all applied in the same logical order. And finally, clarity and control. Need to adjust the contrast? You just go to the contrast node. Now, to build your own structure, you have to understand what's going on under the hood. There's an order to how Resolve processes your image, as shown here in this diagram, but there's a second diagram you should be aware of too. You see, every node has its own internal order of operations. It's a fixed, unchangeable processing pipeline. So, if you perform multiple actions on one node, you have no control over the order in which they are performed. This is exactly why we use multiple nodes, because we get total control over the order of adjustments. Now, as you start to build a tree, there are two types of adjustment you should be thinking about. Macro level, as in ones that will affect all of your shots, and micro, meaning ones that will affect individual shots. Now, in that first macro category, you need to address your color management and any overall creative look that you're planning to apply to the whole video. Then, on a shot-by-shot basis, you need to fix any problems like reducing noise or flicker or banding, and then you need to make your primary corrections and your secondary corrections. Now, primary corrections are the foundation of any color work. It's where you make broad, global adjustments that affect the entire image. The goal is to balance the video, making sure that your colors are accurate, that your exposure is correct, and that the overall look is consistent from shot to shot. Then secondary color correction is a more targeted process you aim at specific parts of the image. You could be trying to enhance specific colors, like make the blue of the sky more vibrant. You might need to do some beauty work on some skin. Maybe you're selectively brightening or darkening certain parts of the frame to try and guide the focus of the viewer. So let's zoom out and work on the big macro adjustments first before we get to the micro ones. Now we're going to start with color management. There's two main methods. You could use something like ACEs or Resolve Color Management, and with those, you set it up at the project level, and then Resolve handles all of the technical transformations under the hood, nothing to do with your nodes. It's simple and it's automated, but it can feel kind of like a black box. Now, alternatively, you can build that color management pipeline manually inside your node tree using color space transforms or CSTs. This is a method I tend to use. Now, I made a whole video going through this in detail, which I'll link to below. But essentially, what we're going to do is this. You take your first node as an input CST. It takes your camera's native log footage and changes it into a huge standardized working color space, like DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. Then your last node is an output CST. It takes the image from your working space and changes it into your final delivery format, something like Rec. 709. Then you do all of your grading on nodes in between them. Working in this big color space protects your image from clipping and helps your tools behave consistently if the footages come from different cameras. Now, while you can have these CST nodes in your main tree, what I like to do is group all the shots with the same camera color space together, and then apply input and output CSTs on a group-by-group basis. That way, if I want to make a change, like a different delivery format, I just need to change it on a group level, and then all the shots within that group will get the same adjustment. Again, I go way more into detail in my color management video, so be sure to watch that to get a deeper dive into how it all works. I also want to apply my creative look at this macro level just before my output CST. For consistency, I want all my shots to have the same look applied, and then I grade on a shot-by-shot basis underneath that look. Now, when I say my creative look, that could be anything from applying a bit of split toning or adding a film emulation. There are all sorts of different tools that exist to do that. Within Resolve, you've got film emulation LUTs that come with your installation. If you've got the full studio license for Resolve, you've got the Film Look Creator. Then there are tons of third-party tools as well. You've got plugins like Dehancer, which I did a full review of, and I'll link to that in the description, along with several tools called DCTLs. DCTL stands for DaVinci Color Transform Language. It's a scripting language used within Resolve that lets people create something you can apply like a plugin through the DCTL effect. So you could use something like Filmic Contrast from Pixel Tools to apply a contrast curve, or tools like Look Lab Print or Film Elements from Mononodes. They're also great options. Just be aware you do need to have the studio version of Resolve to use DCTLs. Once you have your macro adjustments organized, it's time to start putting together the bulk of your node tree where you'll be working on a shot-by-shot basis. Now there's several types of nodes, but to begin with, there's three main node types you need to master. First of all, we've got the serial node. When you use these, the output of one node flows directly into the input of the next. It's a simple, sequential chain of events. So for instance, you might have a node for balance, then that feeds one for contrast, and that feeds one for saturation, and so on and so on. But what if you need to do multiple adjustments without them affecting each other? This is where parallel nodes come in. With parallel nodes, you get multiple branches that all receive the exact same input from the node before them. Their outputs are then blended together equally. Then we've got the layer node. This also creates branches, but they function a bit more like layers in Photoshop. The bottom node in the stack is a top layer, and that's weird and makes no sense, but that's the way Resolve works. So any adjustment you do is placed on top of the previous layer node. And you can also change the blend mode of a node to control how they interact. This is perfect for more complex compositing tasks. I also made a video about how different types of nodes work, so I'll link to that as well. But now we're going to talk about the actual adjustments, the order I usually perform them, and some of the tools that I use. Now, you're going to find lots of different advice here on YouTube and elsewhere about this. So this is the point where you need to start experimenting and finding the tools and the methods that work best for you. This is my thought process, and there's going to be plenty of people that will disagree with me. I'm sure I'm going to meet a bunch of them in the comments. Now, to begin with, I want to preface this by saying the vast majority of the footage I work with on a day-to-day basis is kind of short documentary type shoots. That means it's often shot in less than ideal environments with little control over the scene. So the first few nodes I want to add are reserved for fixing issues. Let's start with the big one, noise reduction. Now, this is usually my first node. My logic is I want to have the cleanest possible image before I start adding any adjustments that might amplify all of that noise. There's also some benefit to performance. You see, since noise reduction is one of the most computationally intensive processes in Resolve, if I place it first, that allows the result to be cached. Then any adjustments I make downstream of that node don't change it. And that means I don't have to recalculate and recache that node every single time I make a change somewhere else. Now, it's not without its issues though. Applying really heavy noise reduction to a low contrast log image can sometimes cause artifacts or kind of an overly soft plastic look, because the algorithm can struggle to tell the difference between fine detail and noise in the flat image. Some people argue for placing noise reduction at the end of the tree, just before the final output CST. The noise profile of an image changes as it's graded, and increasing contrast and saturation can make noise more apparent. By placing noise reduction at the end, the algorithm analyzes the image as it's intended to be seen, which in theory means you could get a more precise and targeted reduction of the final visible noise. The problem is this method is extremely demanding on system resources, because any minor adjustments to the grade are going to force the noise reduction node to be reprocessed. Some other people suggest a compromise, placing the noise reduction node after your initial primary corrections to establish a decent signal for it to work on, while still allowing adjustments to be made in later nodes without forcing a recache. I should mention that while Resolve's built-in noise reduction is great, there are some who swear by a plugin called Neat Video. I used to use it in my Premiere Pro days, and it does do a great job, though it was always really processor intensive. Now, I don't have the Resolve version to play with, so it's hard for me to compare if it's easier or harder on my machine than the built-in effect. But I do have to say, at just shy of $180 for the full version, I can't quite bring myself to buy it when I already have a tool that gets me great results. But they do have a free demo if you want to try it out. Another node I have at the beginning of my tree is a DeFlicker effect. We have lots of shoots in offices where we've got monitors or lights that can cause a flickering nightmare. Now, the built-in effect does do a pretty good job, but there are times when it doesn't work as well as I'd like, so I've had to turn to a third-party tool from Digital Anarchy called Flicker Free. It's another spendy one at $199, but it has saved me on a few occasions, so I really can't complain too much. After this, I'm going to place a compound node, and within here, I do things like patch replacements or selective blurs. Now, the reason I use compound nodes is sometimes I have to use several of these effects for one shot, and having them grouped together inside one compound node means I can add as many nodes as I need in there, and it's not going to affect the overall numbering of the nodes back in the main tree. Now, this is important for two reasons. The first is because I like to grade in passes. Now that means rather than making all the changes I'm going to make to a shot, I go through a series of similar looking shots and I adjust something like exposure so they're all consistent. Then I'll do another pass for contrast or saturation. If you go to DaVinci Resolve, Preferences, User, Color, you'll find a section called Switching Clips. If I set this to Select Same Node, as I switch shots, I'll have the same numbered node selected, and I can quickly fly through a series of shots, making adjustments on the same part of my tree. It's also important for rippling changes. If you've added extra nodes in the middle of your tree on one shot, after you added that tree to your other shots, and you didn't set it to Preserve Node Numbers when adding nodes, rippling a change to other shots will break because the numbers aren't going to match. Now, if you want me to make a video going more into detail about rippling changes, let me know in the comments. Now I'm going to talk about primary corrections. The order I usually do them in is exposure, white balance, contrast, and saturation. For exposure, I go to the HDR palette and use the global exposure dial. This gives a photometrically accurate exposure change like you were doing it in camera. Plus, it's measured in stops, so if your DP or your director tells you to raise it 1.5 stops, you aren't going to be guessing compared to some of the other controls. For color balance, a tip I learned from Cullen Kelly is to set this node's gamma setting to linear, the luma mix to 0, and then make adjustments using my gain wheel, and that seems to give really clean and accurate results. For contrast, unless I really need detailed control using curves, my first stop is usually just the contrast slider in the primaries palette. Now with that said, if you're using this tool, you want to make note of what number the pivot point is set to. If you want to increase contrast without changing the exposure of middle grey, you need to set the pivot point to the value of middle grey for the color space you're working in. In my case, I'm working in DaVinci Intermediate. Thankfully, the fine folks at Mononodes have gone to the trouble of doing all the maths and listing the middle grey IRE numbers for a ton of different transfer functions. So I know I can type in 0.336 in here and I won't be changing my exposure. One other thing worth mentioning about contrast. If I bring up my vector scope, watch what happens to my saturation when I increase or decrease the contrast of the image. Now, one thing I've been doing recently is changing the blend mode of the contrast node to luminosity. When I do that and make the same changes, you'll see the contrast is increasing without changing my saturation. That means I can make the changes to that separately. For saturation, I'm turning the color space to HSV, which stands for hue, saturation, and value, and then disabling the hue and value channels 1 and 3. Doing this gives me a really nice subtractive saturation that I can control using the gamma and gain sliders. Subtractive saturation essentially lets you add greater depth or density to your image without simultaneously making it unnaturally bright like a saturation slider. Another good option here is to use the saturation controls in the color slice tool, which has a similar effect and lets you target individual colors. Honestly, pick your poison. I just think either option looks significantly better and more accurate than the regular saturation and color boost tools. Another advantage of reusing a node tree is that all of these settings that I've changed on the nodes, like the composite mode or the gamma, are all saved along with it. That means I don't have to make those changes every single time. Now, before I forget, there's one tool I want to bring up at this point that I've been playing with recently, and I'm really enjoying it and seriously considering adding it to my template node tree. And that's the Powergrade DCTL from Pixel Tools. It's built as an all-in-one tool for all your primary adjustments, but it also comes with a bunch of really other useful tools as well, like false color and a skin tone checker amongst others. I love that you can select the methods of different primary controls, like whether you want subtractive saturation, if you want the exposure tool to act like the offset wheel or linear gain, that kind of thing, without having to make changes to the node like its gamma. It's also got some overlays you can turn on, so when you're making adjustments like contrast, you've got visual representation for the changes you're making. That's especially helpful for people new to color grading. In the past, I've used a combination of a grayscale ramp and a waveform scope to help visualize what a tool is doing, but it's cool to see these kind of overlays integrated into the tool itself. Now, the issue is that it's combining all the primary adjustments into one tool, which is kind of the opposite of how I like to work. But I did write to them to ask if I'd have issues putting this on multiple nodes if I wanted to use different parts of the tool in different places, and I was told I wouldn't see any performance impact. But anyway, it's a great tool. I would highly recommend you check it out. Now, my only hesitation with using this, or any other third-party tool for that matter, is that I work as part of a team, and sometimes with contractors outside of this company. So if you start sharing projects around where you've used a ton of third-party tools, that can start to cause problems down the line. It's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so that's all of our primary adjustments. Now when it comes to secondary adjustments, when I'm selecting certain parts of the shot rather than the entire thing, I like to work in parallel nodes so that I can tweak one adjustment without breaking the selection I've made in another. So say I wanted to select the brightest part of the image and make a change. And then I wanted to pull a key of a particular color and make a change to that as well. If these were serial nodes, if I went back to the previous adjustment and made a change, it could break my key, and then I would have to make that key all over again. Now, I know if I was to make a change in my primary corrections at this point, I would also have an effect on these upstream secondary corrections. But the way I look at it, I think you should be getting your grade 90% of the way there with those primary corrections. So it's really rare I actually make any changes to them once I'm at that stage of making more detailed adjustments. If I've got a problem with my skin, that probably means I did a bad job of color balancing in my primary adjustments. I do usually have a serial node after my secondary adjustments, where I can make an overall global adjustment after the fact if I need it, but you should really get your shot in a good spot early. I usually have a couple of stacks of parallel nodes. One for color adjustments, like hue versus hue, or changing the saturation or brightness of a particular color, and then a second stack for power windows. I'll pre-build a couple of common shapes, like an inverted circular window to make a vignette, and that saves me from having to go to the window palette and create them every time. Now, while I've been labeling all these nodes as I go, I usually leave these blank and label them as I use them, since every shot might need something different, and I don't want to make a ton of pre-labeled nodes just in case, when I usually only actually need a couple of them. Then towards the end of my tree is where I would start looking at things that add texture, like halation, glow, or film grain. I know if you're using some kind of film emulation plugin like Film Look Creator or Dehancer for the creative look, you have tools for these kind of texture effects built into that, so you'd be tempted to do it all in one node. But I find those are the sort of things I really want to set on a shot-by-shot basis, so I separate them out from the emulation I'm having applied at the macro level. At this point, I want to briefly compare node trees from a couple of colorists I'm sure you've come across here on YouTube if you're watching a video like this, because they have very different methodologies. Here's one from Cullen Kelly that's very stripped down, and here's one from Darren Mostyn that's got significantly more nodes. When you compare Cullen's minimalist tree to Darren's more comprehensive one, it reveals a crucial point. The best node tree is not about a specific number of nodes, but about a workflow strategy that aligns with the way you work. Cullen's tree is built around a few multi-purpose nodes. While Darren's tree might look complex, he rarely uses all of the nodes on a single shot. They're there in case he needs them, providing a consistent and predictable layout with nodes disabled but ready to use at a moment's notice. There is a third option. A few years back, I watched a presentation on Low Post by Walter Volpato, I think that's how you say it, about fixed node structures. He showed a tree he built specifically for a film called Midway he was working on that had lots of sky and water in the shots, so part of the tree is built around that, with nodes he knew he'd likely be reaching for a lot. So you could approach a tree on a project-by-project basis, where you prep nodes you know you're going to need. The important thing is use the same tree on each shot within a project, so it's easy to ripple changes across shots. It doesn't mean every project has to always have the same tree. So with all that said, which kind of tree works best? It's the one that works best for you. Now to figure that out, you've got to ask yourself these questions. First of all, what kind of projects am I working on? Commercials, documentaries, narrative films? These can help you determine your need for speed versus flexibility. What cameras do I use? That's going to define how you set up your color management. What are my most common tasks? Do you do a lot of skin work or beauty touch-ups? And make sure those tools are built into the tree in advance. And finally, what's your personal preference? Do you like a blank canvas with just kind of a few versatile nodes? Or do you like a fully stocked palette with every tool you think you might possibly need ready to go? Once you've built your node tree and you've labeled your nodes and saved it as a Powergrade, make sure you export a still and save it somewhere you can always access it, like Dropbox or some other cloud service. But most importantly, don't be afraid to change it. Your node tree is supposed to be a living document. As you learn and your needs change, your tree should evolve with you. Now, if you scroll down to the description, I'm going to put some links to the tools and the videos that I mentioned. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments and I will try my best to get you an answer. While you're down there, be sure to give this video a like to help other people find it. And remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on more Resolve tips and tricks just like these. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.